thank you all so much for joining us. We're going to take a look back at Boston TV tonight with Donna Halper. We're joined by media historian and author Donna Halper, PhD, for her popular presentation, Looking Back at Boston TV, the programs and personalities we love to watch. We're going to travel back in time through 7 decades of Boston television, focusing on some of the biggest events and biggest stars, including names like Jack Chase, Rex Trailer, who I inadvertently called Red Trailer, so I do apologize for that. I'm showing my my lack of age, I guess. Major Mudd, Miss Jean, Bozo the Clown, Chet and Natalie, Jack and Liz, Mike Lynch, Bob Lobel, and so many, many more. A professor of communication and media studies at Lesley University, Donna was a 2021 recipient of the Broussard Award, which is given annually by the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication to professors who excel in the teaching of media history. So Donna, congratulations on your recent award. And all of us who are watching here live and those that will be watching on demand, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Donna for joining us here tonight. And Donna, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
I can take it away. And in fact, I will take it away. First of all, 2 things, a little bit of housekeeping here. This is the Jewish New Year, and I'm Jewish, and some of you may be as well. So I do want to wish you a very, very happy and healthy New Year. The most important thing, health. We've all been through an awful lot over the past year, but you know what? We're here, we're alive, we're healthy. What a privilege. And that leads me to housekeeping number 2. I'm a cancer survivor, and this is, if I make it to December, this will be 7 years that I am cancer-free. Donna, why are you telling us this? Well, just because of the fact that it's never a bad idea to take a minute to be grateful. And for myself, I am eternally grateful to be alive and to be able to do these presentations. Radio and television have been my life for 4 decades, okay? And when I get invited to do this sort of thing, I love it. So thank you very much for being in my audience. Thank you very much for having me. And I hope you will find our little trip down memory lane to be informative, interesting, and bring back some memories. A warning though, we're talking 7 decades. I'm good, but I ain't that good. There is no way that I'm going to get to every single person. Okay, this happens every time I give a talk. Somebody's like, yes, but you didn't mention. You're right, I didn't. And I'm very happy to look into anybody you ask me about. If I didn't mention them and I know something about them, it would be my pleasure to do a little research and send you what I find, because people are always asking like, hey, do you remember so-and-so? Because everyone likes something different. So maybe you saw, maybe you remember the old test pattern. Remember these? Remember these? Remember the test pattern? Now I'm going
So Donna, I think we lost you for a second there. I think you're muted.
Am I back?
You're back.
Okay. So how much did we lose? I mean, I just solved all the problems of the universe and it all got lost.
Yeah, in that 5 seconds we lost you. So I think you were trying to share your screen. So do we want to try that again?
And remember I warned you, I said like every single time I try to share a PowerPoint screen, this always happens. So
it worked in our practice round. It worked. Let's try it again.
Those were the days. Okay, so let's see if we can make this work here. Let's try this. No, that didn't do it. Okay, give me about a second here while there you go. Is that better? Is that large enough, or do you need larger?
We're still just seeing you, Donna.
Oh, that isn't very good.
You and Baby Yoda.
Oh, me and Baby Yoda. Okay, well, let's try something else. Now, this worked a couple of minutes ago.
It did.
Let's try it this way. Yes, no? Can you see it? No?
No,
Okay.
so
I'll tell you what I'm going to do. Let me just go back here, because what may have happened when you lost me, you may have also lost the fact that I was sharing my screen.
Right.
Let me return. So thank you to everybody who's being patient with this, okay? This is just life in the technology world, okay? And these things will happen. And let's see if we can make this work the way it's supposed to. Now, can you see my screen?
We can, Donna. It looks great.
Well, thank you to everyone for being patient.
And Happy New Year, Donna.
Well, thank you so much. Am I large enough? The slides, are they large enough?
Yes.
Okay, great. So once upon a pond in a kingdom far away in Boston in May of 1948, an amazing thing happened. A test pattern. People were amazed. They really were. Because for months, Boston was supposed to get television. Now, it wasn't clear when Boston was going to get television. In fact, it was quite difficult to ascertain. Nobody knew, nobody understood, but there we were waiting to get television. Okay, now my screen is going crazy here, so we'll just make the best of it for a second. My apologies, okay? One of the things you learn in our little Zoom world is that sometimes things don't go the way you want them to. So I'm going to dump out of this for a second, if I may, and try something entirely different, okay? So when the test pattern came along, people were just amazed because they had been hearing for months that Boston was going to get television. They didn't know when. And then it happened. Other cities already had it, but we got it in May of 1948, except the studios hadn't been built yet. It wasn't until June 9th, 1948, that the first actual broadcast went on the air from WBZ TV. Arch McDonald, some of you may remember him. Arch McDonald was the person who put it on. He did the first broadcast, and they were building the studio around him. Talk about professionalism. They're hammering, they're banging, and he's just reading the news. Nerves of steel, okay? Arch McDonald did come over from radio. He knew how to handle this. He would later distinguish himself covering prison riots and other stuff like that. He was quite the newsman, okay? But this is how it all started. Now, if you're wondering, like, why did my screen keep going to the next slide? I guess it wanted you to see this. This was the first time that a baseball game had ever been telecast to the mass audience. Now, baseball is first telecast in Boston in June of 1948. But so few people had a TV set, it wasn't kind of like mass communication. It was kind of like, oh, you're one of the 7 people that has a TV set. Good for you. In fact, most people had read about the fact that T-Day was coming, but they didn't know what to make of it. So a manufacturer put out on Boston Common a whole bunch of TV screens so that people could just watch the World Series because the Boston Braves were in it. And it was an amazing event. People just stood out on the Common to watch the Boston Braves. But still, very few people have television. In fact, by the end of 1948, maybe 30,000 people, maybe. And maybe you were one of them. Maybe you remember going over a friend's house to watch television. It was a big deal. But television doesn't really start becoming a factor for another year or so. Meanwhile, WBZ is the first television station on the air in Boston, like I said, June 9th, 1948. WNAC, Channel 7, goes on next. Channel 7, They go on the 21st of June in 1948, okay? But it really isn't until 1950 that we start seeing all kinds of people on the air and all kinds of people watching. Now, this is a picture of some folks that you may or may not remember. Your parents might. This is a vocal duo called Hum and Strum. Max Zides on the right, Tom Currier on the left. I know what you're thinking. Who are Hum and Strum? Well, that becomes part of the story. Anytime there's a new mass medium, you always get a transition of people who made their name in one mass medium, and suddenly they've got to make their name on the other. So Hum and Strum were radio stars. They had hit records. They were recording artists, and everybody loved hearing them on the radio. In fact, Bob and Ray, the famous morning team of Bob and Ray and afternoons on the network, Bob and Ray, they did a parody of Hum and Strum because a lot of people didn't like them. A lot of people thought they were really sappy. They liked them as people, but and yet when television came along, Hum and Strum were one of the multitude of radio people that made the transition over to television. And they were very successful at it. They had their own show for a while, long since forgotten, but it's kind of interesting to see what was on the air in those early days. Early TV programs in 48, 49, 50, about 15 minutes long. 1950 is when we start seeing some interesting programs that have staying power. Community Opticians, they make eyeglasses. They put a program on the air called Community Auditions. Now I know what you're thinking. Dave Maynard. He's later. The original host of Community Auditions was a guy by the name of Gene Jones, and he is the first host. He's a Berkeley School of Music guy. He does a lot of public readings, very talented performer. But he put Community Auditions on the air. Dave Maynard doesn't pick it up till the 1960s. Also in 1950, another very popular program, which probably wouldn't make it today. It was kind of a precursor to Meet the Press. It's called Starring the Editors. And what it was 4 editors of 4 major newspapers in Boston. Because back in those days, Boston had 8 newspapers. And every week, 4 of them, the editors would go on the air and they'd talk about current events. It was really interesting to people. So you had Starring the Editors. You also had Groucho, and you had a number of other really famous people who you had, as I said with Hum and Strum, you had only heard them. Groucho had been on the radio doing really well, but he also made the transition over to television with no problem. Some of you may remember You Bet Your Life. Say the secret word and the duck will fly down. You can still see that on YouTube, I believe. There are old kinescopes of it. But you'll notice that this magazine that I scanned is from May of 1950, because like I said, in 48 and 49, television is still a novelty. By 50, boom, a lot more people are watching it. In fact, we're going to hit 1 million people really soon. Now, if you're a kid, and some of you were, you may remember children's programming on television. Miss Frances, Ding Dong School. Miss Frances was Frances Horwich, and she was an actual kindergarten teacher. And she did a program in Chicago that became wildly popular. And even though she had never thought of herself as a TV star, she ends up on the network, doing a network version. And pretty soon, a lot of local stations, including in Boston, as we will discuss, start having their own local children's shows. Some of you may remember, I mentioned Miss Jean with Romper Room, okay? We've got Eileen Nealon, the lady of the bookshelf. We got a whole bunch of story ladies and story gentlemen. We got people doing all kinds of stuff, including someone else I'm going to talk about in a minute, Big Brother Bob Emery. Much will be said about him in a minute, but we're starting to find in the early 50s, with the baby boom, with the post-war baby boom, you got so many kids at home, and television becomes a nice, easy way to entertain and to educate them. And there he is, Big Brother Bob Emery. Now, by this time, Big Brother's an older dude. Big Brother got his start on radio, wait for it, in 1921 on Greater Boston's first radio station, 1XE, later WGI. Big Brother gets a show on WEEI, which stood for the Edison Electric Illuminating Company, WEEI Radio. He gets his own show on WEEI in 1924. Oh, my friends, in 1952, he's still doing it. He had already made the transition on the Dumont network in New York, but he was from here. And when he had a chance to come back to Boston, he jumped at the opportunity. And on the 8th of November, 1952, he made his debut doing the Big Brother Club on WBZ television. And he always used to have a toast to the President of the United States. Now, there are some online myths, and by the way, be very careful of online myths. Most of them are just utterly nonsense, okay? There are always myths about children's show hosts, like, oh yeah, when the microphone was off, he used to swear at the kids. He said, that'll hold the little, it never happened. It never happened. Big Brother Bob Emery liked kids. Now, agreed, there were times when the kids were kind of annoying, but I know an awful lot of people that knew him, and they said, like, he was just calm under pressure no matter what. Ditto for Bozo the Clown, ditto for a whole bunch of the folks that did children's shows. So when you read some of those stories, or even when you have somebody, oh, I remember that they... If you hear something enough times, you start thinking like, yeah, must have happened. I sure heard it enough times. But nah, there's not a lot of evidence that Big Brother swore at the kids, was rude to the kids. Nope. He was on the air in his second life as a TV star as kind of the kindly old uncle. And there are so many kids, maybe some of you in the audience, who remember being on the Big Brother show and going to the WBZ studios. Now, here's something I remember because I'm old. Yeah, 74, but still young and cute. When I was a kid, we had rented a house in Revere, and Hurricane Carol came barreling through, and it took power off the air for a week. Just kind of like what the folks down in Louisiana are going through right now. That was us in 1954, okay? And in the summer, in late August, Hurricane Carol not only barrels through and takes out the power, it takes the WBZ transmitting tower, boom, cuts it in half. This is all that was left. The tower fell. It missed a couple of cars by this much. It missed the studios by this much. Jack Chase was on the air. Talk about nerves of steel. He just like, oh, whatever. On went the auxiliary. He continued doing the news. But those pictures, it was like, oh my God, that could have been a major catastrophe. If that had just hit a little bit more to one side or the other. But fortunately, it missed everybody. And they were able to get the station back up and running. And they were able to get the tower back up too. But yeah, a lot of people remember Hurricane Carol. I remember listening on my transistor radio, thank God for batteries. Now, there's our guy. Jack Chase. God bless him. He was able to just keep doing the news. Jack was a military veteran. He had come back from the Korean War where he served in the Navy, and he came right back. He had started on radio, went over to WBZ TV, funny story about Jack Chase, and if he has relatives, I hope I'm not going to offend anyone, but Jack had a toupee that he wore. And the story I was told was one day he forgot it just before he was supposed to go on the air. And they literally had to send for it in a taxi and bring it to the studio. But with or without a toupee, Jack Chase was beloved on Boston television. He had that calming voice, make it a good day. He really loved doing the news. He was good at it, and he really made a difference for the Boston audience, particularly during the hurricane. Now, here's somebody I knew for years. This is Rex Traylor, and he went on the air with that children's program, Boomtown, Rex and Pablo, on the 28th of April, 1956. And Rex was a gentleman. He really was. He knew how to do rope tricks. He knew how to do all kinds of stuff. I had the privilege, and it was a privilege. I had the privilege of working with him at Emerson College in the later years of his career. He also had his own recording studio. He taught what was called voice and articulation. Today we would call it public speaking. Just one of the gentlemen of the industry. And he too really made an impact on kids in this town. Now, by the mid-50s, the networks are huge, okay? And one of the biggest shows on the air is Dinah Shore. You may remember Dinah Shore. She had this theme song, "See the USA in your Chevrolet." A lot of people that didn't even like Chevrolet remembered the theme song. Groucho was still on. There were a whole bunch of Westerns that were on. There were so many good network programs. And locally, they were still competing, but they were competing with shows like I Love Lucy, shows like Groucho Marx, the Perry Como Show, Ed Sullivan. Ed Sullivan. There was somebody that was huge, and he'd be huge well into the 60s. Maybe you remember seeing the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. But yeah, it was sort of a golden age of television. So there's Bozo. And Bozo was actually a trade name. Every city licensed the name and the character. So Bozo in Boston was a guy named Frank Avrush, another really, really nice person, okay? And he really enjoyed doing it. You may recall he had a sidekick, Judy Valentine. Judy is still alive. She's like 96, sharp as a tack, okay? Lives out in Linfield, I believe. But yeah, Bozo the Clown, there were a whole bunch of different Bozos in a bunch of different cities. Just like with Miss Jean and Romper Room, there was, Miss Karen and Miss Lesley and Miss Roberta, and every city had their own. In Boston, Miss Jean was actually Jean Harrington. She was married to Bill Harrington, who was then a newsman on WHDH. They were long since divorced, but at that time, people used to sit their kids in front of the TV, and there was Bozo on WHDH TV, and I'm going to tell you a few things about HDH TV in a couple of minutes. Now, here's something that when I tell people this, they look at me like I'm nuts. Now, you may think I'm nuts anyway, but I'm not. One of the most popular shows on television was Candlepin Bowling. Candlepin Bowling. This was like a Massachusetts thing. In other cities, it's all 10-pin. If you're from Baltimore, maybe you remember duck pin. But in Boston and in Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont, Candlepin. And that's Don Gillis over on my right. And there's Joe Kalina, who becomes a big champion in Candlepin Bowling. He wins a ton of matches. The hosts for Candlepin Bowling, which went on the air in October of 1958, the hosts were Don Gillis and Jim Britt. Jim Britt was a baseball announcer, but he also co-hosted Candlepin Bowling, which was wildly popular for a number of years. Now, speaking of wildly popular, WGBH goes on the air in Boston the 2nd of May, 1955. It is one of the first national educational television stations. They don't have PBS yet, okay? And WGBH starts carving out a niche with educational television. And one of their most popular shows debuts in February of '63, Julia Child. I love the old camera here. Julia Child with her cooking show. See, even back in the early '60s, people love watching cooking shows. Now, here's someone some of you may remember. That's Shelby Scott. Shelby Scott goes on the air on WBZ in late October of 1965. She comes over from Seattle. And she's going to become famous for every time there's snow, she steps outside, some of you may remember, and they kind of judge how high the snow is by how high it is on Shelby. The things we do to make a living. Yeah, she was on WBZ for years. A lot of people loved her. Around the same time Shelby got here, a guy by the name of Terry Carter also got here. And Terry was, I believe, one of, if not the first Black anchor in Greater Boston, okay? Terry Carter, he went on WBZ in August of '65. Now, there had been Black announcers on radio long before that, in the '40s. But as far as television, we were a little slow with regard to that. So, another really popular children's show, Major Mudd. Now, his real name was Ed McDonald. I think he had like 7 kids. Ed McDonald was, I think, one of the most creative children's show hosts on television. He did Major Mudd as a character from '61 to '74, and it was a really clever show. A lot of the jokes, the kids didn't get it, but the parents did, because Major Mudd understood that parents were going to be watching with their kids. I was like a teenager when this was going on. I used to watch it. I thought it was incredibly creative. He died very young from something that is today totally treatable, diabetes. But back then, it was not. And a lot of people were really, really upset at how his health declined around 74, 75. I think he died in 77 or 78. But his show was one of the most creative TV shows on the air. Now, I mentioned Channel 5 because of Candlepin Bowling. Let's talk a few fun facts about Channel 5, okay? So, Channel 5 has a really interesting history. It was originally, of course, WHDH radio. A lot of people thought it stood for a wee haul dead haddock because it was originally licensed to Gloucester. But no, that isn't what it stood for. In fact, it didn't stand for anything. The call letters were assigned by the government sequentially. The Herald Traveler purchased WHDH from their founders, the Matheson family, in September of 1945. The Herald was the morning paper. The Traveler was the afternoon paper. But they also wanted to have a TV station. And they finally were able to put WHDH television on the air November 26th, 1957. And what was cool about that was they became really well known for sports. Kurt Gowdy, Bob Murphy, Don Gillis, so many others. And that's where Candlepin Bowling went on the air. That's where a whole bunch of other great shows, local shows, went on the air. But we got a problem. There were some real questions about the finances. There were some real questions about political enemies that the owners had made, a long legal battle, and finally, WHDH TV loses the battle. And they go off the air, boom, just like that on March 19th, 1972. Within days, a news station with new owners, WCVB, goes on the air almost immediately. And that's going to become significant because there's a bunch of people that you are familiar with who made their debut in 1972 on the new WCVB. One of them, this guy, Chet Curtis. Now, some of you may remember Chet Curtis. We'll be getting into the part of the program where you're going, oh yeah, I remember him. But Chet Curtis, real name I think was Chester Kukevich or something of that nature. Chet Curtis was with Channel 5 from the beginning. He ultimately meets a young woman who is working there, Natalie Jacobson. Her real name is not Natalie Jacobson. Jacobson was her married name. She was married and divorced. I believe he was as well. They get together, they get married, and they have a humongously popular anchoring partnership on the air on Channel 5 for ages, okay? They finally get divorced and they worked together until December of 1999. Boston had amazing news anchors. I know so many people that didn't even go, oh yeah, Chet Curtis and Natalie Jacobson. No, it was just Chet and Nat. Same thing with the folks on Channel 4, Jack and Liz. But first, let me pause for a second to return to Dave Maynard, who did pick up community auditions in the late 60s. This is a rare photo of him with a, at that time, I think 7-year-old contestant. But yeah, community auditions continues to be a popular show. But in the meantime, we got the news wars. There's Liz Walker, and she comes here from Little Rock, okay? Jack Williams comes here from Pocatello, Idaho. And the two of them ultimately are teamed up. And like I said, the competition between Jack and Liz and Chet and Nat was just amazing, okay? Liz Walker is still around. She ultimately left broadcasting to become a preacher. She is a minister. She became very, very involved in social issues, the homeless, the poor, people in Africa. And she finally decided that she could best serve them by becoming a minister, and she did. And Jack Williams stayed on, retired a few years back, best known, besides being a really good news person, best known for Wednesday's Child, which has gotten so many kids adopted. I must tell you, I've had the privilege of meeting them both. There's a lot of people I know, okay? Some of you know me, some of you don't. I've had a more than 4-decade career in broadcasting. And some of the people that I know, you wouldn't like them very much. Their on-air persona isn't who they are at all. But Jack and Liz, the nicest people you could ever meet. Just down to earth, natural, nice people. The same could be said for Chet and Nat. I had the privilege of talking to Chet in his later years. By that time, he was ill, but just a gentleman. So we were very fortunate in that regard. There were an awful lot of people in town that if you met them, you would have liked them. Now, let's go over to somebody else that I know some of you remember. The guy on the left is John Dennis, okay? And he ultimately goes on the radio as part of Dennis and Callahan. The other guy, that's the famous Tom Ellis. Now, Tom Ellis has a long career in Boston television. He joins WBZ in 1968, then he goes to New York, then he comes back, then he works for Channel 5, then he comes back, then he works at Channel 7, then he comes back, then he goes away. I mean, if there's a station in town that had news, Tom Ellis was there. I believe he was on NECN. I mean, he was everywhere. A long career in doing television news. And he had an awful lot of fans. He passed in 2019. And I know people that watched him right up to the end. He was just such a calming presence on the air. And I know a lot of people enjoyed his newscast, no matter where he was working. This is something Boston became known for. While it is true that a lot of people went from station to station, they tended to stay in the market. Maybe they went to Channel 5. Maybe they went to Channel 7. Maybe they went to WGBH. Maybe they went back to BZ, but they were here. And in that regard, we were very lucky because we were able to bond with a lot of the folks that we saw on television. Now, here's somebody that I used to adore. Now, he used to joke all the time that he did not have a face for television. His teeth were crooked. I mean, this and that. People loved him. This is Artie Saul. I believe it was Raleigh David Saul. If there was an award for a nice person, Artie Saul would win. Okay, there's just, it isn't even close how many people enjoyed watching him. He was on the old WHDH back when it was Channel 7. He was an anchor there from 1983 to 94. Then he went over to NECN, New England Cable News. Ultimately, he left the industry, became a professor at Boston University, and did some public relations, still around, still does some speaking engagements, but I used to really enjoy watching him. I thought he was such a credible news person, okay? But here again, I'm just making my own point over again. We were lucky. We had a lot of anchors that people felt like, I know this person. I'm comfortable with this person. This person relates to me. That's how people felt about Liz. That's how people felt about Natalie. And that's certainly how they felt about people like Jack and RD and Tom Ellis. Now, in 2018, WBZ held a reunion for their old staff. And over here, to my left, we have Bob Lobel. Now, Bob Lobel came to WBZ from radio. He was on the air in New Hampshire at a station called WGIR, okay? And in October of 1976, he got hired by BZ. Originally came from Ohio, if I'm not mistaken. Now, over to my far right, of course, Bruce Schwegler. I cannot say enough about the fact that we had some amazing weather people in town, okay? This goes back even to radio. If you are old enough, and this is even before my time, thank you very much, you may remember hearing about a radio person named E.B. Rideout. E.B. Rideout, the E stood for Edward. E.B. Rideout was on WEEI doing the weather from 1925 on. I know what you're thinking. So what, Donna? Nice history lesson you got there. Yeah, except there was this young boy who was listening at home. Young boy named Don Kent. And Don Kent decided that he wanted to do the weather because he listened to E.B. Rideout. When I was a kid, I remember my parents talking about, well, let's see what EB says. I mean, he used all this old equipment, and yet he still was able to be remarkably accurate at forecasting the weather. A long line of really talented radio and television weather forecasters were in this town, including Don Kent and including Bruce Schwegler and Harvey Leonard and so many others, okay? Barry Burbank, et cetera, et cetera. Over here next to, between Jack Williams and Bruce Schwegler, Joyce Kulhawick. Joyce is also still around because that's another thing. that we became known for. Having people who could broadcast entertainment features, movie reviews, TV reviews, theater reviews. Joyce was just so good at it, okay? And with Bob Lobel doing the sports and his catchphrase, why can't we get players like that? Every time the Red Sox would trade somebody away, or the Patriots, and they'd become a big star on another team, and Lobel would be like, why can't we get players like that? Yeah. Bob is still around. He's had some health problems, but the man is a fighter. He's courageous and such a good sportscaster. I miss that team. I really do. That was just an incredible team. Eyewitness News on Channel 4. So I could go on, okay? But the reality is there are so many other people I could talk about. I mean, when I came up with a list of people who were on the air, I was thinking about like little incidents, little things that happened on Boston television. Like, for example, did you know that in April of 1959, WBZ broadcast an educational program from Harvard, and it featured a speaker named Fidel Castro. Yeah, he was doing speaking engagements, okay? And what I love to point out, because I'm a big baseball fan, we came this close to not having to worry about Fidel Castro at all. He was scouted. He was a baseball player, okay? And he was scouted in Cuba by a very well-known scout for the Washington Senators, okay? A guy by the name of Joe Cambria. And Joe checked him out, you know, kind of was like, good curveball, but no fastball. Imagine if Fidel Castro had had a better fastball. He would have been signed as a pitcher by a major league team, and history would have been changed. Those are the kind of little things. I mean, I found so many little anecdotes that I could have told you. But bottom line, I hope I haven't been boring. I hope I have given you some names of people that kind of ring some bells. There are so many others, Jerry Remy, Mike Lynch. I mean, I could go on and on and on. But what I really would like to do is I'd like to take a pause and see if you have any questions, because I noticed down in the chat that some people do. I hope I've been reasonably informative. Thank you for just bearing with me with the technical problems at the beginning. That sometimes happens when I do PowerPoint. Next time I'll just do a Google Doc and it'll be simpler. But however you look at it, I hope it was okay. Baby Yoda and I hope you were entertained and informed. Boston television has influenced so many people's lives and continues to do so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donna. Wonderful job. And Richard in particular has been lighting up the chat with lots of comments. If anyone has any questions for Donna, this would be the time to type them into the Q&A. And we'll spend maybe 10 minutes or so taking audience questions.
Yeah, so please. Because like I said, I can't see you. And that's very difficult for me as a performer, because I'm accustomed to just playing off of the audience. So I'm like, was I boring? Was I okay? Was I interesting? I mean, did the technical problems cause a problem? Could we chop them out when we post the audio and the video? I mean, I'm thinking in that way. And yeah, you know, I had a great deal of fun. I hope you did too. So please, if you got questions, I will try my level best to answer them. If I don't know the answer, I'll make it up.
There you go. And also, so first of all, Richard says, it was wonderful. Many thank yous for the memory. Nancy says, this was wonderful. It made me feel so happy. Thank you. Betty says it was a very interesting presentation. So we appreciate the live feedback here, folks. Can
I make a couple of other comments?
Yeah.
One thing I didn't get to, because I didn't want to focus too much on national, since the talk was about like Boston.
Sure.
I'm thinking like Walter Cronkite, Chet Huntley, and David Brinkley. I'm thinking about the news people in a simpler time when people weren't screaming at each other. I'm thinking of talk radio and talk shows on television in a simpler time when people weren't screaming at each other. I'm thinking of the fairness doctrine. I'm thinking of like when people presented both sides and somehow the republic didn't fall. It was really, I'm not going to say to you that like, oh yeah, the good old, nah. Trust me, as a woman trying to break into the industry, nope, there were no good old days, okay? The industry was very, very conservative. And I don't mean conservative politically. I mean, like, there was a certain look, there was a certain sound. You were supposed to, when Kate Smith, who was, a fuller figured woman, when she went on television and she was very like, I don't care, but she was a great singer. And people had the space for her to look the way she did. Not that there was anything wrong with the way she looked, but I'm saying television really did promote a certain way you were supposed to look. Unfortunately, I think that is still with us. But I think the culture was just not as angry. I think the culture was much more ready to be entertained. And TV did, in fact, entertain us in that regard. And those are some of the memories that I have, is television as a medium for entertainment, not so much a medium for contentiousness and name calling and this and that. And I mean, like I said, there were some talk shows even back then where they were starting to push the envelope. Some of you may remember a syndicated program with a guy named Joe Pyne, Pyne, Joe Pyne. And he did a really contentious, angry talk show, okay? He was the guy that told somebody once to go gargle with razor blades. He was quite a sweetheart, but he was not the norm. The norm was entertainment. The norm was information. That I sort of miss, okay? Otherwise, I still feel very fortunate to have grown up here with some of the great personalities. And I hope I've brought back some names for you. I miss Major Mudd. I really do. I miss Big Brother. I absolutely miss Rex Trailer. I'm so glad I had a chance to work with him. There are so many other people that over the years I had the opportunity to get to know. I feel very privileged to have been in this industry. I am mostly from radio, but a lot of the radio stations also had a TV station. So if you went in to do work at the radio station, you met people from the TV station as well. So are there other questions?
No other questions yet, but Patricia says, I loved your energy. It was a fabulous trip down memory lane. Thank you. And then Dana has similar sentiments. No, I can't say that word for right now for some reason.
Easy for you to say.
Easy for me to say. She says, thank you, Donna. It was a trip down memory lane. I was once in the guest audience on the Major Mudd show, and I saw Rex in person on a number of times. In addition, Candlepin Bowling was recorded for a short time at the Woolston Bowling Alley in Quincy.
Absolutely. Yes, it absolutely was in Wollaston at a certain, yes, because they kind of moved it around from place to place. Very definitely. That is true. It was at the Boylston Bowlodrome. It was at Sammy White's. It did some time in Wollaston. Remember when bowling was like a really big thing? There were people that really, really enjoyed doing stuff like that. So yeah, absolutely. It doesn't surprise me at all that it managed to land in Wollaston. I'm looking for a picture here and I hope I have it. If I don't, I'll just go back to doing something else. Are there any other comments that you're getting while I go look for this picture?
Let's see, something just popped up. Patricia wants an encore. Do you have a part 2 of this presentation that you could give?
I'd like to do the one about radio if I could. I mean, I did one years and years ago, but there's so much more to be said.
Yeah, so we hosted Donna literally about 10 years ago or so, Donna, for her radio presentation on Boston Radio, and we'll likely do that again sometime soon, likely via Zoom.
I would absolutely love to do it. Here's somebody I didn't get a chance to mention. Do any of you remember Janet Langhart? Any of you remember Janet Langhart, who I believe ended up marrying a congressperson. She married Bill Cohen, I think. By the late 80s, there are more people of color on the radio and on television, and more women are starting to get their chance to anchor and to, really cover stories that perhaps they would not have been able to cover before. Oh, this is one other picture, if I can find this here. Let's see if I can. One of the great things about being a media historian is you have the opportunity to have a collection. So let's see if this rings bells, because I mentioned one of these people. I mentioned Judy Valentine. So that's Judy, and that's her then husband. Now I know what you're thinking. You know him. If you're a Red Sox fan, that's Sherm Feller. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, he was the public address announcer at Fenway Park. But he started off on radio and then on television. And the two of them, she was a singer. She did some great performances. And I got to tell you, I am so glad that at 96, she is still with us. He has long since passed, but she is still around. And she has some great stories about what live television was like, because she was Bozo's assistant on the Bozo the Clown show. And she would sing songs for the kids and stuff like that. Live television, you never knew what was going to happen.
All right, Donna. Well, I think we've exhausted the comments and questions. You and I are both getting big heads after reading some of these comments. So I appreciate.
Well, I want to thank you for having me. I mean, if I've entertained your audience, then I'm a happy person, but I wouldn't have been able to do it if it weren't for you.
Well, Donna, we'll do it again with Boston Radio in a few months. I'll certainly be in touch. I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to remind you to fill out that feedback survey. I'm going to email you tomorrow morning. And a reminder, I'm also going to include a link to this recording. So if you know anyone in your life that you think might be interested in the last 45 minutes, please pass the recording along to them. It would be appreciated. So Donna, any last words before we wrap up?
My only last words are be happy, be healthy, be grateful. Thank you.
All right, we'll end it there. Happy New Year to Donna and anyone else celebrating. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their evening. Thanks again, Donna. Have a good night.